Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome to PIELC 2015. We would like to start off the evening with Gordon Bettles, who is the steward of our Many Nations Longhouse here at the University of Oregon and a proud member of the Klamath tribe. Gordon, we are honored to have you tonight.
Over the years, I've been very happy to work with public information and environmental centers. So it's been rewarding because this is one of the few venues that you truly get to hear the Native American view on this world we live in. But it goes a lot longer than the starting of this conference. You see, it started in creation. When Kabukamsh and Moy decided that man was going to be created, they got together and created the land. And out of gopher's mouth jumped the deer, fish, the trees, all the plants that came out of his mouth and planted themselves. And when everything was created, he woke up and said, "Now I'll create man." And so he said, your job is to take care of your brother. And he created man and taught the tribes how to conduct ceremonies and giving thanks for the food, for the sacrifice their brothers gave and made for them. That's why we see this. It was something that was created so that we would survive, that we would be happy people. I'll give you the other side. And God's face was upon the water, and the firmament from the water he separated thereof. He created all sorts of animals and fish. And then he created man and gave him dominion over everything. Quite a bit of difference if you think about it in the cultural perspective. These are our brothers. We're not given dominion over them. That's why I'm glad for Public Information Environmental Law Conference, because you can start listening to these points of view. Because this is where we came from. Just something to think about. Could we please rise? And no recording in this part, please. Dat man blijft nog niet boos. Ik catch dit kind wijde story so this. No, let me so they were trying to no. Rahud nanak dua maklak said no, and they so they were to he said no. Kai de koichi of cheese. Did she? Yo Steiners said no. Did she? Rahud Taylor. Rahud maklaks kepka. And so we give thanks for this good earth that we walk. And we give thanks to the Creator for all He's given us. And we give thanks for those things that are meant to be. For we want to live a good life, not a bad one. We want to do what's right, not to throw things away carelessly. Satwaya, welcome. So, old man of the ancients, help us. Chatsma. Baklat. Chalga. Chalga. And to strengthen the words in our way, we'd like to sing a power song. I thought about this ever since I was approached about doing this. And I thought, which power song should I sing? I've made my choice. I hope it does what it does for us.
Is there another line out? Yeah, there's XLR. Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Good evening, and welcome to the 2015 Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. I'm Ann. You can clap. My name is Ann Hauger, and this is Alexis Biddle, Malia Lasordo, Tori Wilder, and Rory Isbell, and we are this year's conference co-directors. PIELC is in its 33rd year, and we are truly humbled to serve at the helm of this amazing conference. Some of you are about to experience PIELC for the very first time, and some of you were here in 1983 when just 15 speakers and 75 participants gathered to create a revolutionary conference experience for environmental advocates across the globe. There's nothing quite like PIELC. Over the next few days, there will be more than 130 panels, 12 keynote speeches, and panelists representing over 18 different countries. Whether you are new to PIELC or a long-standing member of the PIELC family, we welcome you to Eugene and to this conference. We hope you will be inspired by the people you meet and find rejuvenation in the conversations you have.
And that's what we're here to do, to meet each other and become more inspired. PIELC serves as a platform for environmentalists of all stripes to come together in one place and share our passion and knowledge. Together in one place, we are able to create a bolder and stronger front against the forces that are destroying the one planet we call home. Some of the most passionate discussions I have ever heard have taken place at this conference. It's not unusual for people to disagree. For example, you might hear people debate about whether a green energy paradigm is possible within current rates of consumption. Some people believe that environmentalists should break down our current economic order, while others intend to reform existing policies. These differences sometimes appear irreconcilable, but PIELC is not about solving these differences. It is about opening doors. We are here to participate in a space that spurs the free collaboration that we so desperately need. Please join us in this opportunity for a respectful and productive conversation.
The theme of this year's conference is changing currents. Currents are fluid movements with definite direction, yet they are by no means predictable or stable. The currents around us are ever-changing, and now these currents are changing more than ever. Our climate is rapidly shifting, changing the atmospheric and oceanic currents that drive the weather and changing the ecosystems that sustain life. The world's social and political currents are also changing. Scientists and policymakers alike are beginning to recognize our complex interrelationship with the natural world. Our values are diversifying as the voices of previously excluded communities are included in the discussion of our common future. But as our population and consumption continue to grow, an ever-increasing demand for energy and resources strains our natural systems, and the changes in our physical currents are accelerating.
Swimming alone against the currents is not our only option. We know that if we join forces, we'll be able to change directions. In the words of our keynoter tonight, Kathleen Dean Moore, we are the people of the river. We just need to find our rocks and collectively throw those rocks into the river and change directions. That's how we're going to change things. All of us in this room together, everyone finding their rock and bringing it to the table, throwing it into the river, and changing the currents.
In the spirit of this year's theme, the keynote presentations and panels we will hear over the next 4 days express both a sense of urgency that we must change currents and a sense of hope that change is already underway. All across the nation and the world, communities are asserting their rights to their lands and rejecting corporate control of our future. Massive protests and blockades of pipelines and megaload shipments are taking a stand against the fossil fuel industry. Hydraulic fracturing is being banned at the local level, with states and some countries following suit. Other campaigns to assert our right to our environment are also being won. Counties are banning unwanted agricultural practices. Disadvantaged communities are refusing to let their children and loved ones be poisoned by toxic pollution. Lawsuits challenging livestock feeding operations to protect clean water are being won. States are exploring creative ways that land use and transportation planning can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Just this year, the Oregon chub was the first fish in the nation to be delisted. And through collaborative conservation efforts, wolves are now howling throughout Cascadia. This year's conference, should we howl? This year's conference will provide an opportunity to challenge each other and discuss solutions and strategies for how we may move forward in confronting the world of today with an eye towards tomorrow's reality. Thank you for joining us at the 2015 Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. The times they are a-changin', and so must we. So in 2015, we're changing currents. Thank you. So now, to introduce our first keynote speaker, please welcome the founder and director of Alternative Radio, David Barsamian.
Well, good evening, everyone here in Eugene and from all over North America. I just met a couple of people from Moscow, Idaho, and Livingston, Montana. So it's great to see you all in one room and galvanized and energized, hopefully, by what happens in the next few days at this particular conference. The program that I do can be heard locally on KLCC every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Among many voices featured are Vandana Shiva, Sandra Steingraber, David Suzuki, Maud Barlow, Naomi Klein, Winona LaDuke, and many other eco-activists. So if you're here in Eugene, I hope you tune in. I'm going to be introducing Amy Goodman in a few moments, but I'd like to just briefly review the very distressing and dreary corporate media landscape. I have here, I'll hold it close to the mic, a t-shirt from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in New York. It says, "Don't trust the corporate media." That's actually a somewhat misleading statement, because you can trust the corporate media, particularly on eco-issues, to fabricate, to invent, to lie, and to distort. That's why we need an independent media that's free from corporate control. Right now, in here, the cradle of democracy, the United States of America, in the year 2015, 6 corporations dominate and control the media. They're Viacom, Disney, Time Warner, News Corp, CBS, and Comcast. You have a tremendous concentration of power and influence in a handful of corporations. Is this good for the democratic needs of a society? Of course not, when you have that kind of limited ranges and perspectives from, instead of A to Z, which would be ideal and optimum, it's more like A to B. And so you have these overpaid gas bag anchors who compete for the best hair on the air. And they're called anchors, by the way, as Howard Zinn once said, for good reason. They're anchored to power. They're not anchored to movements, to grassroots organizations. They're anchored and connected to power. They're lapdogs with laptops practicing a kind of prostitution, not journalism. And, of course, the media here in our great country like to present themselves as cantankerous and adversarial and holding the powerful to account and, really challenging and combative. It's a nice image, but when you look at the evidence, there's nothing to support the assertions that they make about being so challenging and, combative. They are overwhelmingly sycophantic and obsequious. And that's got to change, and that's why we need independent media outlets such as Democracy Now!, Alternative Radio, Making Contact, Low Power, FM, and on, Link TV, Deep Dish TV, etc. The media are large that serve to mobilize support for the special interests that dominate state and corporate power. And there are few nodes of corporate power more powerful than the oil, chemical, petro-industrial complex, which really have an outsized influence on politicians in Washington and in, I dare say, state houses in Salem and Denver and elsewhere around the country. They depend on emotionally potent oversimplifications and necessary illusions, and these are repeated endlessly. For example, you'll remember the many times that we're told, well, if we cut back on fossil fuelization, which I call fossil foolization. We're going to be living in caves with candles. You know, we're going to freeze during winters and to scare the population. And this has had, you know, a kind of residual effect that, you know, takes time to unpack and then to, you know, create a media system that is responsive to the people's needs, the people of this country, not the corporations who dominate the political system, which has all become, you know, magnified by absolutely out of control Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United and more recently McCutcheon versus the FEC. Consent is manufactured, the public is reduced to being spectators, and the state capitalist economic system is celebrated widely. We can't really talk about U.S. foreign policy, it's a given. And an embedded assumption in all the reporting that it's about, you know, the U.S. is spreading democracy and freedom around the world. The notion that the U.S. is the major global, not just polluter, but imperial power cannot be really raised in any of these corporate media outlets. So journalism, you know, when I was growing up, had this kind of animating motto, and that was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Maybe you've heard this, it's been on some newspaper mastheads for years. Well, what do we have today? It's the exact opposite. They're afflicting the afflicted and comforting the comfortable. And I think, you know, that's where Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Come in, who have stayed true to that journalistic adage. And Amy Goodman embodies the essence of independent journalism, going to where the silences are, exposing the crimes and hypocrisies and depredations of state and corporate power. Democracy Now! In its 19th year is an audio and video electronic lifeline for many in the United States and around the world. From East Timor to East LA to East Harlem, Amy Goodman and co-host Juan Gonzalez and the brilliant and talented DN staff uncover the mendacities and half-truths and discover the facts. They are reporters who get dirt under their fingernails. They don't care about sucking up to the rich and the powerful. They're getting to the stories that need to be told from below. And when I think of Amy Goodman, and I've known her for 20 or 25 years, the word that comes up constantly is indefatigable. She is tireless. She's an amazing bundle of energy and dedication to getting the word out there. And we're so lucky to have her, to have Democracy Now! She's on our side. Let's welcome Amy Goodman.
That I can't be with you in person or as the future changes. I'm so glad to have this chance to participate. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. Hello, everyone. I am so glad to be joining you, maybe not in person, but with you at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, this 33rd annual gathering, which is ever more important as the world's climate changes. I'm so glad to have this chance to participate. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. Perhaps in the future I can join you there. But also it's a bit of an environmental approach to be able to address you without spending quite the kind of fossil fuel needed to get there. Here in New York, it is snowing outside. I know it's not so bad for you in Eugene, but the extreme weather must be dealt with. It's not just about what we wear when it gets freezing cold or when California is dealing with drought. It's about what we can do about it. I'll talk about that in a minute, but special thanks to organizer Alexis Biddle, who's been extremely helpful in facilitating this address. I know he's one of many who've been working for many, many months to pull off this conference, and all of you in Eugene who brought this remarkable group of people together should be applauded. Oh, speaking of remarkable people, you have in your midst David Barsamian, a truly gifted journalist, writer, and one of the most prolific producers in public radio. If you don't know his work and the incredible program he produces, Alternative Radio, which is going to be celebrating its 30th anniversary, make sure you meet him during the conference and learn more. I understand he also plays sitar very well, although I don't know if he's planning on playing this year. Thank you, David, for the work you do, for kindly introducing these remarks today. So, changing currents is the theme of this year's conference, and what an appropriate title, given the extremes of weather we've been experiencing this winter. The science is so clear, but the media isn't. That's right, the science is very clear on the reality of climate change and the role human society plays in creating it. Sadly, our political system is broken, seems less and less able to address this growing crisis. Part of why we have this broken system, with powerful people and institutions insisting that global warming is a hoax, is that we have a broken media system. Right? We have daily weather reports all through the day and night across all the network news programs with screaming graphics and dazzling displays announcing extreme weather. You know, they now don't have just weather centers, they're extreme weather centers, or they are severe weather centers, and they're correct. But they should be linked with another two words. That's right, climate change. It should be the Global Disruption Center. Because that is what will make people make the connection between disparate weather events. Whether we're talking about drought in California or extreme cold in the Northeast, not to mention the Southeast. The South hasn't known anything like this cold or snow before. Sure, I mean, Buffalo has lots of snow, but 7 feet in a matter of hours, Niagara Falls freezing over. Why aren't the meteorologists on television talking about this, making this connection? Everyone's tuning into them for this. I remember watching CNN the other morning, and the news anchor or the news personality, I don't know if you can call them news anchors or journalists, said, I'm in denial over this weather, she said, because she couldn't deal with it. Well, they are in denial. And she throws it to the weather person who says, he says, what more is there to say? Weather report. What more is there to say? Link it to global warming. Link it to climate change. People aren't stupid. But if you have extreme heat and extreme cold, when you have floods and you have drought, you're not going to make the connection unless someone starts talking about the science. I mean, this is such a basic demand of the corporate networks. Start talking climate change, not an occasional special, but every time you talk about the weather. It is so important. We need a media that tells the truth. You know, that's why I appreciate all of you who watch Democracy Now! And if you don't, find out about it, democracynow.org. We're not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers when we talk about war and peace. We're not brought to you by the oil, the gas, the coal companies when we talk about climate change. We're brought to you by people like committed to learning and to finding out independent information so you can, make up your own mind. And there's so much we must do about climate change. You know, Many years ago, I was sitting in our Pacifica radio station in New York, WVAI. I did a morning show with my co-host, Bernard White. And our show was packed. We were excited for the morning. And then this Nigerian activist comes in through the door of WBAI, and he's with another Nigerian activist. And we said, oh, we're so sorry. We've got a book show today, but why don't you come back? I said, we didn't know you were coming. And I said, I'm so sorry. We have no time for you today. And he said, oh, no time. My friend has no time either. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, there was just something in the way he said, my friend is out of time. That friend, by the way, was Ken Saro-Wiwa, this remarkable Nigerian activist who was the head of the Nigerian Writers Association. He threw in his lot with the Ogoni people. He is Ogoni himself in Ogoni land near the Niger Delta. And he said he was going to dedicate his life to taking on Shell. His name, again, Ken Saro-Wiwa. He came on the show, he said, to tell us about the nexus of corporate and military power, the Nigerian military dictatorship and Shell Corporation, and what it was doing in the Niger Delta. Shell Corporation, which had crisscrossed his land with oil pipelines above ground, and they were burning off the gas. They were flaring it, something that isn't allowed in the United States. So there were these apartment building size flares. The children of the Niger Delta of Ogoni land didn't know a dark night living in the shadow of the flame, not to mention what they breathed in. So here we are, learning about Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, clearly away from the media spotlight, which is why Shell could do what it did. And Ken sat there in our studios and said, I'm a Marxist happening in my country. Activists on November 10th, 1995 were executed. But his legacy led to a movement all over the world challenging large oil corporations from despoiling the land. I vowed when I met him in our studio to someday go to Nigeria. I went there a few years later, determined to see what Ken was talking about. I went there with my colleague Jeremy Scahill, and I'm sure you know Jeremy, who wrote Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He would later also do the film and write the book that really challenged drone wars that the US conducts around the world. Jeremy and I visited Ken Saro-Wiwa's family, went to the area of the Elijah land. There we were looking at another corporation. That corporation was Chevron. In 1998, when we were there, we heard the story that villagers told us that they had just decided to protest another oil spill that destroyed their mangrove forests. They were sick of it. And they were sick of Chevron coming in, never giving them jobs, wrecking their environment. And they went to a ship offshore. They demanded to speak to the head of Chevron. They wanted him to be flown in so that they would be able to negotiate with him. And so they waited. They occupied this barge. And then they saw, coming through the sky, the Nigerian military flown in by Chevron itself. The helicopters landed on the barge. The soldiers got out. And as the people were standing, actually thinking that it was the people who would be negotiating brought in by Chevron, they opened fire on those on the barge. They killed 2 of the villagers, others tortured. That's just a story. One. We came back to the United States. We did the documentary Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. You know, in our country, we have the power to make a difference. We have the responsibility to do this because of what US corporations do in other parts of the globe. It's our responsibility. They get chartered here. You know, the people in the Niger Delta call themselves the host communities. They were hosting these oil companies. They thought, here are the most powerless people on earth, providing power for the most powerful companies and countries. We must challenge this. So Democracy Now! Has covered all the climate summits, from Copenhagen, bringing out the voices of people inside but also outside, where it's most interesting to be. Thousands of people go to these summits. We went from Copenhagen to Bolivia, Cochabamba, there the People's Summit took place. We went to Cancun, we went to Durban, we went to Doha, we went to Warsaw, Poland, and this past year we went to Lima, Peru. And I want to talk a little bit about Lima and the significance of that meeting that took place there. You know, when we went, it was just this past December. You might wonder, why do we waste the fuel to go to all these UN summits? It's because people who risk everything to go to these climate summits, often they're not even allowed in, but they still go to make their voices heard. It's necessary to understand the setup. This was Lima, and you know it's going to lead up to the Paris Summit, though it's supposed to be a binding. Who's at the table and who's not? Inside that summit, that it proceeds in an orderly way, with UN police standing watch, a rarefied air of diplomatic decorum. It's hard to feel any sense of urgency, astounding as the science is clear. The world is warming rapidly, and without action, catastrophic climate change will soon become irreversible. So the official COP20, that's what this year was known as, Conference of Parties, the 20th year, being held on the grounds of the Peruvian Army headquarters, ominously called El Pentagonito. That's right, the Little Pentagon. That's where this summit was held. In this militarized zone, the UN Climate Summit occurs in a Potemkin village with formal ceremonies and intermittent pre-approved protests. The imagery is not lost on many Peruvians organizing for climate justice, like Wilfredo Saavedra Morelos, president of the Environmental Defense Fund of Cajamarca, told Democracy Now! It's a farce. The representatives of the states of the world are meeting in a place that's stained with blood. In El Pentagonito, that military base, they've extrajudiciously executed our brothers. They burned them. They disappeared them. That's what he said. Outside in the bustling city streets of Lima, a city of more than 8 million people with internal jams, grassroots activists so held their own People's Summit on climate change in a park across town. On December 10th, which is Human Rights Day, thousands of people marched through the streets demanding genuine action on climate change. Among those who was at the Lima Summit, as he's been to many, was Pasco Sabido. The group Corporate Europe Observatory, is called CEO, is organizing both inside and outside these summits. Together with other groups, they released a report, and I hope you get a copy of it, called Corporate Conquistadors, the many ways multinationals both drive and profit from climate destruction. At one action inside the summit, Sabido and others descended on a meeting sponsored by Shell, Chevron, and other fossil fuel interests. He said there were lots of very angry and active people there trying to protest against the presence of the fossil fuel industry in the talks. He said 20 years we've been going without progress towards a fair, ambitious climate deal that we need. One of the big reasons is because of the aggressive lobbying of the fuel industry, both at the national level and at the talks, he said. Another organizer at COP20 in Lima was the Nigerian environmental leader, Nemo Bassi. He said something really interesting. He said before he left Nigeria, his temperature was gauged twice to determine if he had a high fever, if he had Ebola, right? He said now the temperature of the Earth has gone 0.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If the Earth was to go through the same process, it would have been quarantined because the Earth would have been judged to have a high fever or Ebola. But we can't quarantine the Earth, said Nemo Bassi. We need to find who are the climate criminals and quarantine them. He said we need to find who are the climate criminals and quarantine. That was the Nigerian activist Nemo Bassi. It's also important to note who wasn't at COP20. Yeb Sanyo was the lead climate negotiator for the Philippines last year. To the shock of many, he was delegation this past year and was at home in the Philippines as his nation was devastated by Typhoon Harupi. Sanyo tweeted, "They can silence my mouth, but they cannot silence my soul." Now, you may remember Yeb Sanyo if you follow these summits or watch Democracy Now! He made waves at COP19 in Warsaw, Poland. The Philippines was being hit then by another typhoon, Haiyan. Sanyo wasn't sure if his family had even survived. In an emotional address inside the summit, he said, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when? If not here, then where?" Many climate activists from the Philippines think concerted pressure from the US and European governments prompted Yeb Sanyo's removal as he was becoming a forceful proponent of climate justice for the global South. Atosa Sultani was also there. She's founder of the nonprofit group Amazon Watch. As I met up with her outside one of the People's Summit events, she still said, despite all the COP's deficiencies, she was glad that the global gathering took place in Peru, where more than 60% of the country, an area the size of Texas, is rainforest. She said, "It's the first COP ever in an Amazon country, and the Amazon is incredibly important in the climate debate. It's the heart of the planet, pumping moisture and vapor." She said that's why this COP is important, to put the Amazon on the map, to put indigenous rights central to the debate, and to call for the end of the fossil fuel era. That's why we're here, she said. This is why we go to these climate summits. This is why we will head as well to Paris. Because of the remarkable determination of people all over the world desperately trying to call the world's attention. You know, in Europe even. The debate isn't does climate change exist, you know, is it caused by human beings and human activities? It's what do we do about it? In the United States, it's like as if the media, even when they discuss it, it's like when every time you talk about is the earth round, you have someone on from the Flat Earth Society to debate it. And why is that? Well, who funds the media? You know, every 5 minutes, what are the commercials you see? ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell. That should give you an idea. And who funds the politicians? You know, who are the forces behind? Who are those powers? Like the Koch brothers. They are oil barons. That's where they get their billions, determining politics in this country. They know they can't just outright say that human-caused climate change is not true. So they set up these think tanks, what some call stink tanks, obfuscate, to raise questions. We know from the tobacco industry decades ago, especially young people are not having it. We learned so much from these summits. I want to go back to Durban, South Africa, where one of the summits took place, to the speech of Anjali Appadurai. So it was like the last day of the summit. People have been protesting outside, but young people were invited in. And Anjali Appadurai was asked to give a speech. She went to College of the Atlantic. She was a student there. I don't know how many of you know it. Sort of like Evergreen, but it's in Maine. You get a degree in human ecology. It's a fascinating place. I have visited there. And Anjali got up and she spoke to hundreds of people. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We're the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game?" she said. "Lobbyists, corporate influence, money." She said, "You've been negotiating all of my life. In that time, you failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before." She said, "We are in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The world's poorest countries need funding for adaptation now." Anjali went on, "The Horn of Africa need it yesterday." And she said, as 2012 dawns, this summit was in 2011. She said, "Our Green Climate Fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years max, and she says, you're saying give us 10. And then she looked at the people in that room, the diplomats from around the world, said the most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms, she asked. Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. She went on, there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. She said, stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation and to condemn millions to death by climate change. She said, what's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. She ended her speech by saying, respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said, it always seems possible. She quoted Mandela saying, it always seems impossible until it's done. So distinguished delegates and governments around the world, deep cuts now, get it done. You know, at that point, the chairperson said, thank you, Ms. Apatarai, who was speaking on behalf of half the world's population. I think she said at the beginning. She said, the person said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half of the world's population first in this conference, but only last. And I thought, well, this is a big change. You know, you have young people represented, then they marched out of the room and they marched outside, and that things maybe could change. Until we tried to find her the next year at the UN summit, and, well, she wasn't there the first week. She'd been banned from the summit. That's why grassroots action is so important. You know, when we went to Lima this past year, it was hard for us to head down to Latin America at that moment because Ferguson had happened, the protests, and of course the killing of Mike Brown in August and the mass rage. We flew from Ferguson, Missouri, to Latin Island, where there was mass around the death of Eric Garner, the 43-year-old grandfather who had been selling loose cigarettes. That was his, he wasn't even selling them, he had just actually broken up a fight. And he's a in Staten Island, and the police moved in on him. And the reason we know what happened next, they took him down, wouldn't get off him, as 11 times he said, I can't breathe. So after covering all of this, we went down to Lima. And you know, one of the first protests we saw at El Pentagonito, at the military base, which had to be so reinforced because these climate summits, people are so frustrated. One of the first protests we saw were people doing a die-in, saying, I can't breathe. I thought this was fascinating, making the link, the grassroots in this country, a movement for accountability, the movement for taking on those in power and taking their power from them, in this case the police, holding them accountable, and making that link to the climate, making that link saying, I can't breathe, to the fossil fuel industry. Just think about this. And I wanted to end by talking about what's happening this weekend. That's right, this is the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, of March 1965, when hundreds of people gathered in front of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you know who Edmund Pettus was. He was a Confederate general who was captured 3 times, who was the Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan and would become a U.S. Senator. That's who that bridge is named for. And people like John Lewis Lewis, though there's no one quite like John Lewis. He was a young, 20-something-year-old activist with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he and others decided this was the moment that they would walk for, fight for, maybe even die for voting rights so people could have a say in their country. They lined up. At this point, Dr. King was not there. He joined later in March. And they started to make their way over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they were beaten back by Alabama state troopers. John Lewis's head was bashed in, his skull fractured, others were knocked unconscious. And the reason we know about this is cameras were actually there. And these horrific images broke into TV screens all over the country. The bravery of these young people and old, every age, everyday citizens who said, we're not going to take this anymore. This is the story of Selma. It's so important. And we need a media, by the way, that expresses the voices of people at the grassroots. There is nothing more powerful. Yes, the fossil fuel industry is extremely powerful. Those who have profit over it seem to control our politics, inundating politics with money, drowning democracy in money. But there is a force more powerful, and that force is all of you. That's right. All together, more powerful than any individual. You know why President Obama has vetoed the Keystone XL pipeline. It's because, starting a few years ago, more than 1,200 people got arrested outside of the White House. Bill McKibben, 350.org, all the folks. Naomi Klein, the great writer, and I hope everyone reads her book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. It's so important, but they got arrested. And then a number of people there came up to New York, where I am right now, just down the road, Zuccotti Park, and on September 17th, marched thousands of people and began the Occupy movement. If you think Occupy didn't have an effect, that the police eviscerated the encampments and, it just sort of fizzled out, think again. Everyone knows what the word Occupy means now. And when you say the word 99%, everyone knows what you're talking about. 1%, everyone knows. When you change the language, you're well on your way. It is so important that you've gathered here today. Public interest, environmental law. These are such critical issues that you take time from your busy schedules to gather, to share, to discuss, to further this all-important challenge before humanity. It is not hyperbole to say that the future of our species is at stake. You've gathered to elevate practice of environmental law in the public of interest. It is such a noble effort, such a critical effort, a monumental effort that the changing currents of our planet demand we take on. So thank you so much for being here, for bearing with me, being with you by video. I want to end going back to World War II, to the White Rose Collective, to young people, students, to a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They were German. They thought, what can we do? And together with their professor and other work, they decided to put out pamphlets, to put out information about what was happening. Information is power. They put out these 6 pamphlets. Across one it said, "We will not be silent." And they figured out every which way to get these pamphlets out. They dropped the night in a marketplace, in a schoolyard, in an alleyway, until they were captured by the Nazis. They were charged, tried, convicted, and beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of all of us today. We shall not be silent. Democracy Now!
We're so glad Amy Goodman can take part in this conference, even from afar. She's very inspiring. To introduce our next speaker, I'd like to welcome to the stage from Eugene's 350.org, Mary DeMocker.
Good evening, everybody. That was amazing. Thank you, Amy Goodman. I am deeply honored tonight to introduce to you one of the great visionaries of our time. Kathleen Dean Moore is a philosopher, a climate advocate, and a gifted writer, best known for her award-winning books of nature essays entitled River Walking, Hold Fast, Pine Island Paradox, and Wild Comfort. To me, Kathleen's body of work is a love song to everything miraculous, not only to whales that sing or frogs that use their eyeballs to swallow flies, but also to us complicated, large-brained bipeds with our boundless capacity for love and our ability to act on that love in astonishing ways. I first met Kathleen 11 years ago on this campus reading her wonderful stories, one about her young son holding 10 scorpions between each of his clenched fingers, and another about her scientist father growing her name in mold, a petri dish in the back family refrigerator. When Kathleen spoke of the joy she felt howling with wolves in Alaska's wilderness, I knew I'd stumbled on a very different brand of philosopher. I signed up for her nature class at OSU, distinguished in 3 decades. Upon and rowboats illuminated by starlight, and in frigid bogs that sometimes swallowed us up to our waists. Each night, Kathleen spread her sleeping bag in a different location. On a picnic table, in a rowboat, or put it. So her intimacy with wilderness led naturally to increasing alarm over its destruction. She was already questioning her role as a nature writer in a wounded world when one sentence from James Speck changed her life. The former dean of Yale's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies opened a 2006 climate conference by saying, "The only thing we have to do to be sure we will leave a ruined world for our children and grandchildren is to do exactly what we are doing now." Kathleen later wrote, "To imagine my grandchildren wandering, hungry, in a barren land changed everything for me. I decided I would never do anything in my working life that doesn't at least try to make the world safe for bog lilies and hooting owls and laughing children." Kathleen examined the climate change debate and found it lacked principled reasons to do right by the planet. This discovery led to the powerful book, Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, which she co-edited with Michael P. Nelson. In 2013, Kathleen left the university to work full-time on climate advocacy. She now speaks around the country about the moral urgency of climate action and is author of a brand new book tentatively titled, "Is It Wrong to Wreck the World?" Kathleen is also beginning to tour a new program entitled Variations on a Theme of Extinction with renowned concert pianist Rachel McCabe. This stunning musical and literary program will be hosted by 350 Eugene on May 7th at the First United Methodist Church. So we gather tonight at an extraordinary and frightening time in the planet's history. As Amy described, we find ourselves, along with billions of others, confronting our own extinction and the irreversible destruction of every life-giving system on the planet by human hands. Mary Christina Wood says it's as if we've leapt from the airplane and desperately seek our parachute cords. I would add that as we hurdle, it is through a darkness filled with the confusion and arguments that arise in any group survival situation. Worse, as we try to build a safe landing for ourselves and children, we find ourselves required to fight off madmen intent on destroying the world. We here in Oregon are now finding ourselves major players on the global energy battle stage as our officials use eminent domain threats to help a foreign gas company build pipelines to export fracked gas to Asia. All of us here fight for everything that we love now, and we get tired. Tired of hurtling through darkness, tired of bad news, and tired of leaders pretending, like delusional kings, that our planetary home isn't overheating. And in such darkness, we need candles. We need a set of instructions for our souls. And this is when a philosopher comes in very handy. And so gathered to do our good work this week together, let's take a respite from the breathless plunge, from the panicked grasping for the ripcord to ask the big questions. How do we as world beings respond to our situation? And here to offer us a little bit of light is my friend, teacher, and hero, Kathleen Dean Moore.
Thank you, Mary. This moment, this night goes down in history. I think it's the first night anybody said a philosopher can come in handy. Maybe so. And what a privilege it is to be here. And what a wonder it is to see all of you. And oh my gosh, what a privilege it is to follow Amy Goodman. And what a challenge. What a human being. Yeah. The only challenge I've had that was worse than that was the night I had to follow David Sedaris. So I'm really thrilled to be at a conference that's called Changing Currents, here on the banks of the Willamette River, which is high, wide, and running hard. It's a powerful metaphor for what's happening here and what's going to be happening in the next couple days. And I think that's good, because climate change is kind of outgrown the dominant metaphor, the metaphor of the grassroots movement. Yeah, for a while, we were each like little blades of grass. We were each standing straight. We were each of us reaching for the sun. And underneath in the dark, yeah, we were playing footsie, and our roots were tangling together, and we were sharing nourishment. It's a beautiful metaphor, but when I think about grassroots movements, it seems oxymoronic, because grassroots don't seem to move very fast. And what we need is speed. So I think it's just a terrific idea that we have a metaphor now tonight that is a little bit more hydrological. So I've been thinking in this little tar paper log cabin on the east fork of the Toclat River. It was June, it was the solstice, it was Alaska, and it was murderously hot. At midnight on the porch of that cabin, in the shade, 104 degrees. It was an all-time record, and it was drawing a new spike on this graph of the jaggedly rising temperatures in Alaska. Even the Dall sheep left those burning mountaintops and were standing down by us in the river. There were all-time record mosquitoes, all-time record heat, which is a challenging combination, because here I was lying half naked on the bunk, slapping mosquitoes, and next to the wall, there was my husband completely covered by a white sheet, sweating. He looked as still and dismayed as a corpse, because he would rather be hot than bitten, and I would rather be bitten than hot, and both of us were perfectly miserable. And all the doors and the windows were open to let in any kind of relief, even though the doors were studded with big spikes to discourage the grizzly bears. That was another terrible choice. Gnawed by grizzlies, roasted to death. And my job, because I was closest to the door, my job was, if I heard any snuffling, I was supposed to leap out of bed and slam the door. But here's the point. I had come to the Toclat River to think about global warming, and it was not going well. Yes, yes, work this metaphor. We are caught up in a river that's running towards a hot, stormy, and dangerous planet. And yes, the river is powered by huge amounts of money that are invested in mistakes that are dug into the very structure of the land. It's a tangled braid of fearful politicians and preoccupied consumers and reckless corporations and bewildered. That's the question. How do we change this current? Well, there was no way I was going to fall asleep that night, so I pulled on some clothes and I walked down to the river. The Toclat is a shallow river, and it grades across a good half-mile of gravel beds and deep-dug channels. Because the glaciers were melting, it was sloshing with water, unpredictable, chaotic, but there were patterns. Now, as I've said, as I was quoted saying, we are river people here in Oregon. We've spent our lives, little children even when we were little children, playing in the currents of the rivers, building dams, throwing in stones. We know the rules of the river. We know that any disruption that slows a river can reshape the current. And we know that wherever a river piles up against an obstacle, it loses its energy, it drops its load, and it makes an even greater obstacle, yes? And we know that when water curls around an obstacle, the current's own force turns it upstream. Yes, we've seen this. And when there's so many obstacles and islands that a channel can't carry its water and its sediment, it crosses a stability threshold and the river finds a different way. And sure enough, right in front of me, a root ball rolled down the river and it jammed up against a stone. The current divided itself around the root ball. It wriggled sideways and turned upstream. It curled into pocket eddies behind the roots. And even as I watched, that eddy filled up with gravel. With any disturbance, the downstream force of the river turns against itself. Disturbance creates more disturbance. Islands create themselves. So, you know, I just took a rock, I stood there at the edge of the river and I took a rock and I heaved it in. And I was starting to grin, because it suddenly occurred to me that we do not have to stop this river. Our work, large work, small work, together and individually, our work is to make a deflection in complacency, an obstruction to profits, a blockage to business as usual, a stoppage to a big lie, and then another, to change the energy of the flood. And as it swirls around all these snags and subversions, that current is going to slow. It will lose its power. It will eddy in new directions and create new systems and new structures that change its course forever. This is the work of creative disruption. This is the work of radical imagination. This is the work of witness. This is the steadfast, conscientious refusal to let a hell-bent economy row our boat. And this is much better, I realize, than stewing in the night. So really, that's my message tonight. It's to choose your stone and chuck it in. Skip in a bunch of stones, or get together with your friends and roll in a boulder. Heave in a log or a skeleton of a sheep. It doesn't matter. Get in the way and build something new. And one more thing, learn this word, avulsion. It's a hydrological term. It's a term for the moment when a stream bed has so many blockages that it can't carry its load, and it flips overnight and carves a new direction. So that's how I like to think about the work that we're called to do, to create an avulsion that changes this river forever. But there are so many questions. And I guess that's the business of a philosopher, is to ask questions. Not necessarily to answer them, but to ask questions. And so I want to ask 3 of them tonight from this new metaphor. Number 1 is, why me? Why me? I wouldn't have chosen this time. I wouldn't have chosen this role or this responsibility. Why do I have to do this work to keep this extractive growth economy from wrecking the world? Question 2. What is standing in our way? Something. What is it that's keeping us from getting off the dime? And 3, what are they going to do about it? Okay, so let's go with the first question. Why bother? You know, why are you here tonight? Why am I here tonight? We're going to be dead probably, at least some of us are going to be dead before the truly horrific effects of climate change kick in. What does it matter that a couple decades from now, salmon are still returning to the stream? Why does it matter that healthy children are humming themselves to sleep and sandhill cranes are returning to the meadows? Why does it matter? Well, my answer is that it's an issue of moral obligation. That's why we have to fight this, because we are morally obliged. It's clear to me that although climate change is an economic problem, it's truly a scientific problem, it's a technological problem, it will surely be a national security problem. But fundamentally, climate change and the associated environmental destruction, injustice, is a moral problem, and it calls for a moral response. It's not just stupid. It's not just astonishingly stupid to wreck the world. It's wrong. You know, I have to tell you that I sent my new book to my agent. It's the one that's called "Is It Wrong to Wreck the World?" And she said, you know, that's a downer book. Nobody likes downers, she said. That's true. But here's what I believe. I think that to take whatever we need for our profligate lives and leave a ransacked and destabilized world for our children is selfish beyond imagining. And to let it slip away, this world, this extraordinary world, the song in a frog's throat, the evergreen hillsides, those green, impossibly green fields, the chances of the children, to let them all slip away because we're too busy or because we don't care enough, to let it slip away, that's a sin. And when the big oil executives, who increase their already unimaginable profits, when to increase their profits, they knowingly take down the great planetary systems that sustain human life and all the other lives on Earth, what are we going to say about that? That's moral monstrosity on a cosmic scale. Whoa, people say to me. Can you say that? No. I mean, can I say, as a philosopher, am I allowed to say moral monstrosity? I mean, these people are moral monsters, you know. That's moralizing or pontificating, the sorts of things that popes do, but not you, Kathy. And you're always talking about right and wrong, and aren't you vilifying and demonizing and shaming and polarizing and all those things? Yes. I stand before you and I reclaim my right to moral outrage. I listen to my Buddhist friends. They advise compassion. Fierce compassion, they say, but compassion nonetheless. And the Dalai Lama explains that the destruction of nature and natural resources results from ignorance, greed, and lack of respect for the earth's living things, not from black seed of evil in the soul. I can understand that and generally accept it. But should that keep me from naming the ignorance, the greed, and the lack of respect, which were, the last time I looked, vices? Should compassion for the person prevent me from naming the horror they're creating, not as an unintended byproduct of their decisions, but as the knowing, directly intended, or homicidally reckless, and very carefully calculated consequence of their decisions? And law students, isn't that what culpable wrongdoing is? The knowing and intentional doing of unjustifiable harm. So, as I say, I believe in moral outrage. I claim it as my right. Because outrage is a measure of what a person cares about the most, what you love, what ideals you affirm, what breaks your heart or dashes your hopes. Outrage is a kind of truth-telling, naming wrong for what it is, flinging away excuses. Outrage is in fact a kind of respect, treating these powerful decision makers as responsible human beings, not as victims of the system or idiots, although they might be. Outrage is a response that acknowledges and bears witness to the suffering of innocent beings. Outrage is an expression of love. Outrage is one step away from overpowering grief. But I'm a philosopher, and I know that I have to give reasons to support my views. And I'm really committed to moral reasoning, this reasoned public discourse that allows us to affirm our deepest beliefs and check them against our actions and the actions of other people. Scientists have reached this great consensus about the facts of climate change, backed up by evidence. What we need is a corresponding consensus about the moral urgency of climate action, backed up by a clear idea of our values. So I want to invite you to think about the logic of this. It requires me to talk about Aristotle. It's okay to talk about Aristotle? And the practical syllogism. It goes like this. Any argument that's going to have a conclusion, if this is based on scientific evidence, but you can't get from facts alone to a statement about what we ought to do without a second premise. And that's the normative premise, that's the moral premise, that's the moral affirmation. I believe in this, just abomination. If you know the way the world is, and if you know the way you affirm the world ought to be, then you can draw a conclusion about what you ought to do. So our work, I believe, our work is the work of the second premise. Our work is to be clear about what do we dream, what do we cherish, what do we seek. If we don't know that, we don't know where to aim. Environmental activism can't be only against things. So people, what are we for? At this point, some people always say to me, of course you think it's a moral issue, you're a moral philosopher. That is naive, be real. Ethics never changed anything. It's not about people's vision of the good. It's about the economy, stupid. Well, that's a misreading of history. I would offer up to you my claim that every major change in the United States history, every little, fast, big change has been the result of a rising wave of moral affirmation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, that great moral, and the European democracies toppled like dominoes. All persons held as slaves within any state shall be then thenceforward and forever free. And the direction of history reversed its flow. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up. It took a long time. It took a lot of suffering. But the troopers and the growling dogs stumbled back. Hell no, I won't go. And that pathetic war ended. What if we stood up for what we believed in? What if we created a new Declaration of Independence? Try this. All beings have a right to a healthy and life-sustaining planet. And this right overrides the presumed right of the few to plunder the common heritage and destabilize the Earth's future without restraint. Or try this. The earth shall be healed as Mary said, my colleague and I decided that we were going to try to create this national discourse about values, and so we wrote to 100 of the world's moral leaders. People like the Dalai Lama and the Pope and Desmond Tutu and Wangari Maathai. And we asked this question: please tell us, in 2,000 words or less, do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities as our own? Their answers came back in beautiful essays that we grouped into 15 different kinds of claims. 15 reasons why we have to stop climate change, and I want to read every one. For the survival of humankind, for the sake of the children, for the sake of the earth, for the sake of all forms of light on the planet, to protect human rights, to honor our duties of gratitude, for the full expression of human virtue, because all flourishing is mutual, for the stewardship of divine creation, because compassion requires it, because justice demands it, because the world is beautiful, because we love the world, to honor Earth and Earth systems, and because our moral integrity requires us to do what is right. The law students in the group will recognize what we're doing. We're trying to do parallel pleading, where it's not just one reason that we all buy into. No matter what worldview or what politics you bring to this question, you will find a moral reason on your own values why you need to act. Now, I'll talk about two. Only two, because that's all the time I had, because Amy did such a beautiful job of talking about justice and about human rights. I want to talk about one reason, which is that climate change is a failure of reverence. And we spend a little bit of time on that because it speaks, I think, to people, no matter whether they're conservatives or liberals, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Oregonians. We all can wonder at this extraordinary chance that we find ourselves in the Cenozoic era, when evolution has achieved its greatest fullness of flowering, what the theologian Thomas Berry called the most lyric period in Earth history. You stop to imagine our good fortune that we live in the time of thrush song and 30,000 species of orchids, the time of microscopic sea angels with tiny wings and whales that teach each other to sing. Imagine that. The time of crocodiles and butterflies with curled tongues and a bat no bigger than a bee. Thomas Berry also said, it's our generation that's witnessing the end of the era that we evolved in. My generation has done what no previous generation could do because they lack the technological power, and what no future generation will be able to do because the planet will never again be so beautiful or abundant. The Earth has seen extinction before. At the end of the Jurassic period, an asteroid killed 89% of all beings, including many dinosaurs, all of the dinosaurs. In the 4 countries, the rate of extinction now is 58%. We can start tearing out the pages in our field guides. It's madness, the choices that we make. It's a desecration. And unless somebody stops us, we're going to keep on converting living creatures into dead commodities. We trade dead mossy forests for uselessly large homes. We trade wide-winged albatrosses for plastic 6-pack rings. We trade meadows miraculous with butterflies for My Little Pony factories. Dear God, the madness. We trade a singing marsh for another Kmart parking lot. It's madness, our consumption, this eating up. We trade rhinoceros horn for male sexual potency. We trade bear spleens for sexual potency. We trade Tibetan red deer for sexual potency. What is this overriding need? We trade fence rows and goose sloughs for yet more golf course grass seed. We trade an oak thicket for student housing nobody wants. We trade spotted owls for typing paper. What are we thinking? For oil terminals, we give away the salmon. love oil terminals more than we love salmon. It's a frenzied, mad auction of what's of ancient value for what is cheap and desperately sad. It's a mad rush to the end of the world. And the most terrible trade is the transmogrification of plants and animals into human flesh. Daniel Quinn said it. Since 1970, the biomass of the human species has gained 50 million tons. It came, of course, from other members of the community of life. As a result, the world is losing 150 species a day. We're turning 150 species a day into human fat and gristle and stuff. The point being, of course, is that whether we think the world was created by God or whether we think it was from the creative urgency of the universe, this world is irreplaceable, it's essential, it's beautiful and fearsome, it's beyond human understanding, it's astonishing. That's the language of the sacred. So this reckless destruction is a desecration, and climate change is a failure of reverence. So let me speak just very briefly about our love for our children. And let me claim that if we do let climate change blow up, we will have betrayed our love for the children. There's this new letter out, a consensus letter from 500 scientists led by a Stanford team, and they say, unless we take concrete, immediate actions, by the time today's children have grown to middle age, the life support systems of the earth will be irretrievably damaged. Who are those children? I know one of them. Her name is Zoe, and she's my granddaughter. In the evening, she sings herself to sleep. When she's middle-aged, the Earth's life support systems will be irretrievably damaged. Unless we stop fossil fuels, they will live as well as they can in a world of violent and chaotic weather, spreading disease, water shortage, collapsing agriculture and fisheries systems, wars for resources and massive movements of people driven from their homes. That's a betrayal of the children. Brian Doyle, a Portland poet, wrote this way. I said, Brian, write down for me, what is the nature of our obligation? Why do we have an obligation to the children? And he wrote, because we swore and vowed to every god we ever imagined or invented or dimly sensed that we would care for them with every iota of our energy when they came to us miraculously from the sea of the stars. Because they are the very definition of innocent, and every single blow and shout and shiver of fear that rains down on them is utterly undeserved and unfair and unwarranted. And because we used to be them, and we remember dimly what it was like to be small and frightened and confused. Those are my two reasons that I picked out of that list of 14. And here's the point. You know, others have said this before me. Scientists know how the chemicals respond, and they know how the temperature responds to the chemicals, and how the oceans and the weather respond to the temperatures. You know the drill. Those are the data points. Those are just data points. It's just geophysics. But there's a missing data point. What they don't know is how the people will respond. And that response has the potential to set all their models spinning and the arrows on their charts diving in absolutely different directions. We know what we have to do. Mary told us that. The scientists and the economists, they've all figured it out. We know what we have to do. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. We have to leave them in the ground. So with this overwhelming reasons to act, reasons that are based on our deepest and most fiercely held values, why is it so hard to get moving? So that's question number 2. What's getting in the way? What is stopping us? I'd like to talk about 4 mistakes, just 4. They are big ones. So mistake number 1. This act because we are the enemy and he is. Accounts for the kind of paralysis in our spirits, saying, I can't act against fossil fuels because I drive a car. This kind of self-loathing and self-blame paralyzes us. So we say this, that we have met the enemy and he is us. I want to think about that very carefully, because I don't believe it for 1 minute. It may be one of the biggest triumphs of big oil to make consumers blame themselves for climate change, even while those corporations are spending billions to transform us into mindless consumers of self-destructive and cheap consumer goods and fossil fuels. To make us blame ourselves, even as they leverage their bribes in Congress to make sure that we don't have alternative ways to move around and heat our homes and travel to our jobs and find some way to ease our grief at the fundamental disconnection from the natural world. So when I hear people say, enemies, I have to think really carefully. Yes, I should spend and invest and work and travel more thoughtfully. Of course, I should dramatically cut my use of fossil fuels. That said, the big old corporations are very happy to claim that they're simply responding to public demand, but it's clear how much corporations have been manipulating public demand. I'm not the one who builds and maintains infrastructures that force consumers to use fossil fuels, kill, underfund alternative energy and transportation. Demand for energy-intensive products through advertising. And I'm hiring fake science fusion to defang the regulatory agencies that would limit big oil to impose its risks on others. We've met the enemy, and I'm going to do everything I can to be sure it isn't me. But while big oil is externalizing all its other costs on us, I'm not going to let big oil externalize the moral shame of its attack on us. Sorry, Pogo. Mistake number 2. It's a mistake to think that climate change is about climate change. It's a mistake to think that climate change is about climate change. The struggle for climate justice is a struggle to reclaim democracy. All these issues are connected. So here's a cartoon, maybe you see. No, Frank, where'd the cartoon go? Okay, well, never mind, I'll tell you about the cartoon. There, hooray. I'd like you to meet Frank Moore. He's my husband and I love him. He's so nice to come out. Okay, so here we have a big climate summit, and up on the whiteboard there's this bulleted list. Energy independence, preserve forests, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, healthy children, fresh food, environmental justice, renewable fuels, clean air, quiet, clean water. And then this person stands up and he says, what if climate change is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? What should be added to that list of things that we can get back or reclaim or create if we manage to fight off climate change in the big oil industries? What we need to add to that list is democracy. Obviously, you know this, that this huge financial power of the fossil fuel industry has a terribly distorting effect. And we all know it. Amy talked about it. I don't need to go into the details. I don't need to remind everybody of this horrifying fact that the Koch brothers are going to spend $889 million on the next election. But I will tell you about Plato. Way back in ancient Greece, Plato had this figured out. He wasn't a fan of democracy because he said that every democracy becomes a plutocracy, government by the rich, because you can always buy votes. And every plutocracy devolves into anarchy because poor people will only put up with so much injustice. He had a special name for those citizens who weren't paying attention as this transition from democracy to plutocracy happened. The name for them in Greek, is idiotes, the idiots. So the United States has clearly moved into the plutocratic stage. The question is, can it return to a democracy, or will it evolve into an anarchy? It is that serious. So mistake number 3. climate change has already begun, this is the mistake. Because climate change has already begun, our most important work is to adapt to the coming changes. Adaptation is the name of the game, not mitigation. Okay? That, I think, is the third big mistake, that we're moving so quickly from the effort to stop carbon pollution to the effort to adapt to it. So, I want to offer you a quiz, because I am a professor and it's time. That's it. Okay, here's the quiz. When your house is on fire, what should you do? Okay. A, not one damn thing. B, defame the people who call 911 to report the blaze. C, debate whether the fire is caused by humans or the natural fluctuations in temperature. D, write a grant to study the effect of fire on children. E, formulate a business plan to corner the market on corrugated metal roofing for hovels. F, appoint a commission to study how to adapt to life in the burnt-out husk of a house. Or G, for God's sake, put out the fire while there's still something to save. But I know that when you give students a quiz, they always want a hint. So here comes the hint. Imagine that your children are in this house, and not only your children, but 109 billion other children. Imagine that this house is beautiful beyond imagining, and that you have been happy in this house. It's a sheltering, nourishing place that provides water and warmth and food. Imagine, in fact, that this house is the only possible source of everything your life and happiness depend on. Now, imagine that there's still a chance to save the house, or at least a large part of it, but it's a narrow, perilously narrow chance, and it depends on throwing everything you've got at the fire. Now, what should we say about all the agencies and commissions and special committees who are laying down the fire hoses, pulling back the ladder trucks, pouring coffee all around, and devising elaborate plans for how New York City, for example, might be able to continue to thrive when it's inundated by seawater? How shall we politely respond to Rex Tillerson, who's the chairman, president, and chief executive officer of ExxonMobil, who says, as a species, we have spent our entire existence adapting, so we will adapt to this. This, of course, refers to global warming. So I believe that our primary obligation is to stop that reckless destruction that's caused by the extractive growth economy. And to the extent that adaptation takes energy or resources or will away from that effort, it can't be morally defended. Falsehood number 4. The last one. It's hopeless. It's too late. Nothing can be done. So okay, let's face it. Our options are limited. Our cities and our homes and our transportation systems are disgracefully designed. Destructive ways of living are skillfully protected by tangles of profit and power all around the world. Corporations are behaving like psychopaths, and we have run out of time. The most conscientious person is going to have a real hard time making significant change. And I would quote what Mary quoted in advance of this, Godspeed. All we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and ecosystem and leave a ruined world for our children and grandchildren is to keep doing exactly what we are doing today. There's new polling out showing that, and the polls are about us. They're about the people in this room, those of us who are alarmed or concerned about climate change. 85% of us feel afraid, yes? 81% of us feel sad. 79% of us feel angry. 76% of us are disgusted. And helpless? 61% feel helpless. This is a problem. Because we've designed a world, a society that's fixated on the future. We measure everything we do by its consequences. And so we built a society that can be readily disempowered both by hope and by hopelessness. So notice on one hand the moral abdication of blind hope. Everything's going to be fine, I don't have to do anything. And on the other hand, the moral abdication of despair. No matter what I do, we're all going to go to hell, and so I don't have to do anything. Either way, hope, despair, I don't have to do anything. But notice that that's a logical fallacy. It's a false dichotomy. Because between blinding hope and blinding despair, there's this huge middle ground that we call moral integrity. Moral integrity, it's a matching between what we believe is right and what we do. A life of moral integrity has no space between what we think is right and how we live our lives. So we live gratefully because we believe that life is a gift. And we act reverently because we believe the earth is sacred. And we live simply because we don't believe in taking more than our fair share. And we act lovingly toward the world because we love it. And this might mean this tireless, fierce, maybe even tragic defense of the world against those who would wreck it. So those things, I think, are four things that we have to get rid of before we can move forward. So let's go to our third question, Frank, and let's ask, so now, what are we going to do? Well, by now you know my answer is going to have to do with rocks, right? There are three things we need to do, and we have Joanna Macy to thank for this list. We can categorize our obligations into three kinds of rocks that we are going to pitch into the river. Number one, stop the harm. These are the holding actions to slow the damage to the earth and its beings. We have to stop making it worse. Which means that we have to stop releasing greenhouse gases. We have to leave the world's ancient carbon in the ground. We have to stop paving meadows, for God's sake. We've got to stop buying stuff and eating ourselves sick. So this is the question that each of us asks ourselves, individually and collectively. What destruction can I stop? What oil terminal, what pipeline, what corrupt or craven politician can I stop? Choose one, move fast. Bring art, bring crowds, bring fresh air, bring lawsuit students, bring the children's choir, bring the church choir, bring Bach. Hold your leaders to account. If they sell out to the culture of destruction, throw them out. If they stand courageously against it, stand with them. Not another tundra plain or Arctic sea, not another rainforest, not another estuary, not another canyon land or Oregon farm, not another mighty river can be traded away for cash. They are not industries to take or to sell. They belong to the future of the everlasting earth. Number one, stop the harm. Number two, radically reimagine our lifeways and our livelihoods so that they match our vision of a sustainable and thriving world. Our problem isn't with renewable energy or farm fish or other increasingly desperate means to save our way of life. Our problem is with our way of life itself. And a culture that prides itself on accumulating wealth instead of sharing it. A culture that gobbles up the fecundity of the planet instead of nurturing it. An economy that eats its own feet. An economy of infinite extraction is going to kill off the sources of its sustenance. If Derek Jensen is here, he's going to tell you more about that. So our work isn't to find ways to save this way of life. Our challenge is to save the sustaining world from this way of life's destructive power. Mortal, wildly imagining creatures are, in fact, woven into a beautiful, resilient webs of interconnected, interdependent, and creative life. Those are the three things we need to do. And how do we need to do them? And here's where I will tap into the wisdom of the systems analysts. Three characteristics of all of the things we do, of all of our rocks. Number one, they are wildly inclusive. Solving this problem is going to take the greatest diversity of lifeways and life forms and livelihoods and ideas and tradition and faith, all of us engaging in the greatest exercise of the human imagination the world has ever seen. Number two, They need to be self-replicating. They need to be spin-offs and models for other people's action. And number 3, they need to be self-sustaining, which in my mind means they need to be joyous. Frederick Buechner said, if you're looking for your calling, you'll find it at the intersection of your greatest joy and the world's deepest need. And I think that is right. So let me close by reading just a short paragraph from Clarissa Estes. Here's what she said, and I think that as we sit in this room by this river, and maybe as we walk by the river later on tonight, we might think about these words. Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. Yes, for years we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. I recognize a seaworthy vessel when I see one. There have never been more able vessels in the water than there are right now across the world. And they are fully provisioned and able to signal one another as never before in the history of humankind. There will always be times when you feel discouraged. I too have felt despair many times in my life, but I do not keep a chair for it. I will not entertain it. It is not allowed to eat from my plate. I hope you will write this on your wall. When a great ship is in harbor and moored, it is safe. There can be no doubt. But that is not what great ships are built for. Together, we are a great ship. The currents are shifting under our hull, and we are under sail. I don't want to answer questions tonight because you've already heard what I think. But I do want to give you a chance to say what you think to one another. And so I think what we should do at this point is ask you, as Mary did earlier, to turn to the person who you don't know who's next to you, introduce yourself, and do listening pairs for 4 more minutes, and then we should all go have a glass of wine. Will you, one of you, turn to the other and simply listen to the other one speak?
It was too short.